Today, we're going to present the FLEXvalue open source cost effectiveness calculator. And I want to acknowledge Steve Sufian, who is on the line with us as well today. He's the principal engineer at Recurve. And he really put in a ton of work and did some brilliant things with the code to get it into a place where we could release this as an open source package that is scalable and can run for everybody. And Steve is going to be really the main event of today's conversation because I really would appreciate if folks, engaged in this conversation and actually by the end of this presentation are up and running with this tool themselves. So the goal here is not just to sort of present some slides and talk about, why this is so great. The goal is actually to get people running this tool. And by the end of today, I think anybody who wants to can be running cost effectiveness calculations themselves. You don't have to be an engineer. You don't have to be a subject matter expert necessarily. There is functionality here that you can utilize directly to run cost effectiveness calculations on your own. So just a little bit of background here. For folks who know me, I'm Adam Shear. I joined the energy efficiency world, the demand side world really, 6 or 7 years ago when I started at PG&E. During my time there, I was on the policy team, I was on the programs team, and I was also on the EM&V team. I started in 2014 at PG&E, and at that point in time, we were really worried principally about running great programs. And I think PG&E and all of the other program administrators around the country are still worried about running great programs, but cost effectiveness has become the predominant consideration in many of these jurisdictions. And, from 2014 through about 2018, 2019, that's when folks saw a lot of the cost-effective, low-hanging fruit disappear from energy efficiency portfolios. So things like LED lighting became code. So there wasn't an ability for these portfolios to get a lot of cost-effective savings out of a measure like lighting that could basically buoy the rest of the portfolio. And as a result, the portfolio level cost effectiveness really became a squeeze in a lot of places. And I saw sort of firsthand how the predominant consideration in deciding whether programs lived or died, deciding which programs got scale, which programs got additional investment, versus which programs may have been retired, which programs ultimately received budget cuts, those kinds of things, it became a question of cost effectiveness. And so when we then sort of tried to dive in and use some of the existing tooling, they were difficult to understand, what was really driving cost effectiveness, what was, what were the levers you could pull, how could you optimize programs. A lot of implementers were tasked in the third-party transition in California with running cost effectiveness calculations. They weren't really set up to do so. It was a little bit too complex for them. And it's difficult to QA, QC cost effectiveness scans if there aren't simple sort of inputs and outputs. So, this really became a rock and a hard place kind of situation where we were trying to optimize our portfolio for cost effectiveness, engage implementers in doing so, because at the end of the day, these were their programs, but had a really hard time doing that because the tooling was set up really for a previous era where subject matter experts were the folks who truly needed to use those tools, and it wasn't the broader population. So that's kind of what brought us here today, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of our motivations as I go on. But I just wanted to introduce Recurve here for a moment. I think most folks here are probably familiar with us to some extent, but our mission is really to take data analytics in a transparent way into the world of demand side programs so that we can compete against supply side resources and scale as a genuine decarbonization resource that people can trust. We're really a software company at heart. And at the end of the day, what that means is we are trying to automate a lot of data processes so that using data in demand side programs doesn't have to be the subject just of impact evaluations down the road, but can be the subject of daily optimization and daily management of programs so that we collectively can come into the procurement space and say, here's why you can trust what we're doing we have a system in place that can play on your playing field. So that's our goal as a company, and cost effectiveness and valuation is a huge part of that. So I want to say that this is not a talk really focused on cost effectiveness policy or the theory of cost effectiveness. There are, a lot of strong opinions about cost effectiveness. I happen to have many strong opinions about cost effectiveness and which policies should be in place. So I would just refer folks, if you're looking for a discussion of the advantages and disadvantages of the TRC versus the PAC, and you're looking at, regulatory histories and things like that, there's quite a few resources I would point you to that are in this deck, and we'll share this deck at the end of today or in a few upcoming emails. Now, and like I said before, the goal here today is to have people actually running the FLEXvalue calculator by the end of this presentation. So starting off just kind of with a status quo picture of cost effectiveness tools, cost effectiveness has kind of become a little bit of a zero-sum game with respect to tooling. There's a lot that goes into a cost effectiveness calculation, and there's a lot that is important in cataloging what comes out of CE calculations, making sure that things are compliant. But if it's too complex, then ultimately the results can't be trustworthy. They can't be used for optimization. It's hard to know what's driving the results. So cost effectiveness has really become, from a tool standpoint, too complex for many users. And that's partly due to an input structure that's a bit complex and was built for subject matter experts. It's also because there's a lot of levers, there's a lot of dependencies or variables in the cost effectiveness calculation. And some of this has led to, erroneous results, coming from people who are starting to use these tools that never had to use them before. It's also difficult to QA/QC cost effectiveness runs if there are a lot of inputs and outputs that need to be checked. Oftentimes, these outputs are a bit opaque for optimization and feedback, and that leads to programs that could frankly be better. If the goal of energy efficiency and demand side programs is not only to save energy, but it's to save energy at the right times and to drive the highest avoided costs in greenhouse gas savings, then there's a temporal aspect of this that needs to be at the top of people's minds and needs to be something that can readily be probed in cost effectiveness calculations. So if the tooling is difficult to use in that respect, then the programs aren't ultimately optimized for what the avoided costs are telling us where the opportunity is. And then existing cost effectiveness tools often don't represent modern programs. If you look at, I think this may be a little bit harsh or a little conservative, there are not a ton of independent load shape options. I have 7 here, that's what I'm referring to. There's probably more than 7, but if you look just at the DEER load shapes, for example, in California, we have a database of energy efficiency resources. There's approximately 7 distinct load shapes across residential and commercial. I understand there are some other load shapes, and we'd actually like to incorporate them into FLEXvalue, and I'll get to that in a bit. But if ultimately your load shapes that you are incorporating into your cost effectiveness calculation are not representative of the program, then you get an inaccurate calculation. It's just a question of accuracy. There's also a need for custom load shapes to be available for the calculation of cost effectiveness so that you can optimize programs, so that you can incorporate additional resources